be uh, executed when he got to Jerusalem. So they wanted to know what what were the signs of his return. You know, they had been with Yeshua for quite a while now, and they learned to love the Messiah, and he loved them, and it was a very wonderful relationship they had, and they were very, very close friends, if you want to use that term that we can understand. They were very specially connected. So now they're asking towards at the end of chapter 23 of Matthew, when are you coming back? What's the sign of the second coming, or the return, your return? So that's really what was on their mind during this period of their relationship. They knew they were headed towards Jerusalem. They knew Messiah's end would be soon. They wanted to know when he would be returning. What would be the signs of his return? So Matthew continues to record this discussion that they were having, and he mentions a few things that we understood. For example, he mentioned there would be wars and natural disasters. The temple will be desecrated. Some bad times are going to be coming to Israel and to the Jewish people. So his first section was about the things that were going to happen. Now they're asking him in the second section of this, when will these things be coming? What is the sign of your return? So here in verse 27, Matthew records what Yeshua said, that when the Son of Man does come, it will be like lightning flashes in the sky. Now, this expression, Son of Man, was used as a reference to the Messiah. You can find this expression in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, where the Son of Man is referring to a deity. In fact, that section of Daniel speaks of two beings known as the Father God and the Son God. You'll see it, Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Check it out. So he says that when the Son of Man, the Messiah, comes, there will be lightning flashes in the sky. And I was thinking about this as I put this message together. How are we going to know that the Son of Man has come? What's in these lightning strikes going to be? And maybe it's the Shekinah glory, the Shekinah, that's often spoken about in the Bible, because it says that this will fill the sky from the east to the west, all the way to the western horizon. But how are people going to know about this? And I was thinking maybe this COVID-19 thing that we're all suffering through is like spring training for this event to take place, because all of us are now learning how to use computers and social media and even Zoom, and I imagine there'll be maybe there already are other kinds of products called like Zoom, and everybody's connected electronically. So I think that the revelation of Messiah's return will be easily spread throughout the world. It won't be like in those days where the word had to be spread almost, on foot. This is going to be electronically, be really big. Well, keep in mind that they weren't going to try to hide the return of the Messiah. In fact, there's a statement in Isaiah that reads like this: "Who is this coming from Edom, from Botzra, with clothing stained with crimson? It is I who speaks victoriously, I well able to save you. I have trodden the peoples in my anger, so their lifeblood spurted out on my clothing." Very kind of enigmatic, puzzling verses of scripture from Isaiah 63, 1 through 3, about this event that implies that this is the Messiah speaking, that he went to Basra, which is a place that we can visit and may on our next trip to Israel. Basically, Basra has a city called Petra, and that's what we would want to go visit. Apparently, this is a place where Jewish people were taught to flee in case of an attack. It's in Jordan. So the Messiah says he will come from the wilderness in the east, which is where Jordan is, and go west until he ascends the Mount of Olives, where he will be beginning the end of days. The flash of lightning from east to west is representative of Messiah's path of victory on these last days. Well, this battle is going to be tremendous death toll. It's not something we want to relish in. It's just an awful thing. And it says in verse 28, that's where the vultures will be, meaning there's be a lot of dead bodies here and when this warfare takes place. And I think we know from other portions of Scripture that I've shared with you that the nations of the world will come against Israel. It says in Zechariah to do battle, to do battle. This is the time of Jacob's trouble, when the nations of the earth are going to come against Israel. For some bizarre reason, they don't realize the judgment that's going to fall upon them, but they think that this is going to be a good thing. This is called, in rabbinic circles, the footsteps of the Messiah. There are certain signs, unique signs, that tell us about when the Messiah approaches, when the Messiah returns. It's called the footsteps of the Messiah, footsteps of the Messiah. So it says in verse 29 that following these time of Jacob's trouble, the sun will grow dark. The sun, that's a sign. Now, we have eclipses, and we know about supernatural phenomena that are not always supernatural, but it says at the same time, on the opposite side of the globe, the moon will stop shining and the stars will fall from the sky. These are previously predicted by Israel's prophets. I don't want to go through those right now, but Israel's prophets understood that there was going to be some horrendous things happening in the last days. Now, maybe we would see a lunar eclipse at the same time as a solar eclipse, and maybe a proliferation of meteorites falling from the sky. We don't know. But these signs in the sky are a sign of the Son of Man, meaning the sign of the return of the Messiah. Now, to some people, that's going to be good news. Some people, not so much so. It says in verse 30, all the tribes of the land will mourn at the appearance of King Messiah. Why would that be? Well, most of the tribes of Israel have not trusted Yeshua yet as the Messiah, and so when the end comes, they will have no assurance of God's protection. But our role as Messianic Jews and Gentiles is to proclaim this message to Jewish people, so that our people will be looking forward to the return of the Messiah, not fearing the return of the Messiah, because it says he will come with tremendous power and glory. There'll be no excuses in those days. Either people have chosen to follow Yeshua or not. It's just a matter of a decision that needs to be made, and then the following up on that decision. It says in verse 31 that he will send, angels will come with a great shofar, and the angels will gather together his chosen people. Now, I should mention to you that there's a story in Midrash that from on Daniel, it says this: Elijah of blessed memory will come and give good tidings to Israel, to those who will be alive and to the dead. Messiah ben David, Elijah, and Zerubbabel, peace be upon him, will ascend the Mount of Olives. And we know Yeshua himself did ascend the Mount of Olives on his return to Jerusalem. And Messiah will command Elijah to blow the shofar, and all will come to the Messiah from the four corners of the earth, from east and from west, from north and from south. The children of Israel will fly on the wings of eagles and come to the Messiah. Now, of course, you can see in this whole second coming is really has to be understood in the Jewish context. Some people teach that the church is the key. By church, I mean the Gentile believers who haven't chosen to join with the Messianic Jews, that the church are going to go through the Great Tribulation because they see the church as the new chosen people. And, in some ways that has some positive aspects to it, but it's not true. It's a continuation of replacement theology. Even in the judgment at the end of days, Gentiles will be partakers with Jewish people of not only the judgment, but the blessings that God was going to bring, but not to supplant and replace the Jewish people as God's chosen people. We see that in Romans chapter 11. 17 through 18, where Yeshua speaks of the olive tree. So the Gentile branch of the church has a lot of great blessings and brought a lot of great blessings to the world and great promises. But unfortunately, they've left out the fact that the Messiah is Jewish and the significance of that, not only to the church, but to the Jewish people as well. But there'll be two different times when the shofar will be sounded. The first time will be at the first resurrection of the Messianic believers over the last 2,000 years. Our call to meet the Messiah in the air, 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18. A debate exists as to when this will happen. It's called the rapture by some. I'm not sure exactly if that's the right term for it, but a better description would be a time when the believers will meet the Messiah face to face, maybe in the air, as it says. I'm not sure how that works, but it doesn't matter. We can trust it. Some people say this will take place before the tribulation, before the time of Jacob's trouble, in the middle of it, or after it takes place. And there's good arguments for all three. I hold what's called a pre-trib view, a pre-trib rapture view. I believe that the return of the Messiah to rescue his people, his redeemed people, will take place before the Great Tribulation. And I think initially it'll be for the Jewish believers in Messiah. You know, I get this idea a little bit from Rosh Hashanah. As you all know, Rosh Hashanah is called Yom Truah, the Feast of Blowing, or the Feast of Trumpets. And it takes place over a 10-day period from the initial blowing of the shofar to the ending of the Yomim Noraim, the 10 days of awe. And it ends on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which of course is the Day of Judgment. And interestingly enough, the tradition is at the very end of Yom Kippur, there's a Tekiah Gedolah, one great shofar blast that ends the whole season. And I think we can see in Rosh Hashanah a clear picture of this return of Messiah. The first shofar will blow, and those who have trusted in him will be joining with him. And then at the end of this period of tribulation, there'll be another shofar blown, like the shofar blown on Yom Kippur, which ends that season. So there will be good news for some and not so good news for others. But it's a time we need to be aware of. It's a time of Jacob's trouble, and we need to be alert to what this is happening. Now, he goes on to give some parables or stories of the return of Yeshua. Matthew records some of the parables that Messiah shared at this time. The first parable is the parable of the fig tree. Now, fig trees are very common in the Middle East. They grow abundantly all over the Middle East because of the climate. And it says in verse 32 of Matthew 24, when the fig tree branches begin to sprout and leaves appear, it tells us summer is approaching. So the people understood when they saw the fig tree blossoming, sprouting, and leaves growing, that the summer was approaching. Now, we're not talking about agriculture at this point. We're talking about prophecy. And what is going on here is that Yeshua is saying that this will be like a symbol, a sign of his return when something would be blossoming. Keep in mind, this took place during Passover season. And during Passover season, which is pretty much early spring, that's when the fig trees are beginning to blossom. So in this context, Yeshua is using this image of the fig tree to tell us something. The fig tree was used in the prophets' days as well as a sign. In fact, in Hosea, the fig tree represents the nation of Israel. And the prophet there recalls the fig tree's first figs in its first season will represent Israel in the latter days. So Yeshua specifically picks up on the theme of the fig tree to help his people understand when he is coming back. What will be the signs of his return when the fig tree blossoms? Well, folks, in 1948, the fig tree began to blossom. Israel became a state legitimized by the United Nations and the entire world body, except for a few nations that disagreed. So in 1948, in May of 1948, Israel became an official country once again. even though there had been Jews living there since the 1st century, and that there were many Jews living in Israel in the 18 and 1900s. So this was a sign, though, that the fig tree was beginning to blossom. In 1967, the Jewish nation took control over Jerusalem for the first time for many, many decades, or many centuries, really. And so June of 67 is another indication that the fig tree was beginning to blossom. And I suggest something else. Look at the number of Messianic Jews in the world today as compared to the way it was 50 years ago, when there were very few Messianic Jews. Now the fig tree is blossoming, and look at all the leaves that we call Messianic Jews that are part of this movement that we talk about called Messianic Judaism. It's phenomenal. There are Messianic Jews all over the world, thousands of Messianic congregations, many Orthodox Messianic Jews in Israel. So the fig tree is blossoming, and that's news to us as a sign the return of the Messiah is coming soon. There's another mention here I want to, in verse 34, he speaks of this generation. He says that when this generation sees this, I'll read it to you. Yes, I tell you that this people, or this generation, this people will certainly not pass away before all these things happen. What generation is referring to? Which people? It's the Greek word that's used there is Genea, and Genea has a number of different applications. Genea could be referring to that generation that was standing around when he was talking. Another interpretation of the word Genea here, this people or this generation, is that the ones who see the prophetic signs will be the last generation of Israel. But I think there's something else going on here that probably might be more accurate, that the word Genea can be translated race or ethnic group. And in this situation, and there are some biblical resources that do take that position, that Yeshua is affirming this people, meaning his people, will not pass away before all these things happen. This is a repeat of the promise that the Jewish people will survive and thrive until the coming of Mashiach. That is a fulfillment of God's promise to the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and those who are grafted into the children of Israel, the people of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel shall live. You know, one time the Queen of England was asked by somebody in her court to prove that that God existed, and the person that the Queen asked this of, he said, "Your Majesty, the proof is the Jews. The Jews, by all rational thinking, should not be around anymore, because for 2 millennia and even before that time, people have been trying to destroy the Jews. Yes, we Jewish people still exist. That's a real sign of God's protection of our people." So at this point, you might think that people would start asking more about when this is going to take place, when that prophetic signs are going to happen. And it was not uncommon to ask, quote, when that day and hour will come. No one knows. So you see, he was answering a question that might have been asked, might not have been asked, is when are these signs going to take place? When is this all going to happen? It was a common practice among the rabbis to ask this question. I mean, even to this day, many people ask, when is this all going to take place? Now, you might be interested in knowing there is a theory, and it's proposed in Tractate Sanhedrin in the Mishnah, that there will be 6,000 years of world history, and then the millennium. 6,000 years, 6 millennia, excuse me. So there'll be, millennium means 1,000 years, so there'll be 6 millennia, and then the 7th millennia will be like the Sabbath millennia, or the time of the millennium, the end of the period after the tribulation. Well, that is a reasonable theory, because we are now in the year 5780 from the creation of Adam, the creation of mankind, which is how we reckon this. So we're close to the 6,000th year. What is that? 220 years. But I want you to remember something. The years are sometimes different in number of days in a year, so we have to be thoughtful and cognizant of that when we do these calculations. But the best thing of all is not to make the calculations at all, because if we're wrong, and it could be very destructive to our faith. So that's not of importance. Yeshua says this in verse 36. He says, "No one knows the exact time, not the angels in heaven, not the Son." He's speaking of himself, only the Father. Well, you know what? That reminds me of a Jewish wedding in biblical times. And you might say, what am I talking about? Well, a Jewish wedding would not begin until the father of the groom starts it in motion. Even the groom did not know the exact time when that wedding ceremony would begin. The father of the groom was the one who set this thing in motion, and he did so by the blowing of a ram's horn. So the son didn't know, the bride didn't know, only the father knew when this would be taking place, and he would be instructed for that from, we believe, from on high. So in a sense, I think the return of Messiah, Yeshua, is similar to this the Jewish wedding. Nobody knows, only the Father knows. Keep that in mind. We can see the signs all around us. The birth of Israel was the fig tree blossoming, and we see the signs in the heavens these days. We know there's more wars and rumors of wars, and a lot of stress in the world today, more than I can remember, especially given the coronavirus. But we need to remember that we need to be watchful, because it says the Son of Man's coming will be just as it was in the days of Noah. What does that mean? Well, in the days of Noah, in verse 38, it says, back then, before the flood, people went on eating and drinking, taking wives, becoming wives. Basically, they lived normal lives. And all of a sudden, zap, the flood came. And we don't want the arrival of the Messiah to catch us off guard. We don't need to know the exact time. We need to know, though, that the Messiah is coming back, and he's coming back soon. It says, when Noah entered the ark, they didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. Remember that. Noah was inviting people to come into the ark. This obviously a boat for traveling in the oceans in the middle of the desert. So the people, of course, must have thought he was nuts. But they, in faith, some of them came. But Noah rounded up the animals that needed to be on the ark with him. And then when the flood came, the door was slammed shut. And those people who maybe made fun of Noah or who did not trust in the God of Israel were lost. That could happen again in our lives, and we don't want that to happen. We don't want that to happen to ourselves, to our relatives, to our friends, to our people. We want to get the word out to our people that the time is short and that they need to remember, yes, we're living like in the days of Noah when things are fairly normal except for the coronavirus, but the time is short. In verse 40, another word picture Yeshua gives us. He says, there will be two men in a field. One will be taken and the other will be left behind. Also, there will be two women grinding flour at the mill. One will be taken and the other one left behind. Of course, that expression, left behind, became a Christian book series back about 20 years ago, very popular. And it was based on these verses from 1 Thessalonians, where Yeshua is speaking about the end of days. So what does this mean? The others are left behind and some are not? Correct. It has to do with our position of the Messiah. Are we in the ark or not? If we are in the ark, we won't be left behind when the flood comes or when the end comes. If we're not in the ark, we are lost. It's as simple as that. It's just a matter of a decision. And you can make it right now, telling God you want to trust Messiah Yeshua for your salvation and you want to get in his ark in order to be rescued from this terrible time that's coming in the near future. So in verse 42, he summarizes all these parables and all these word pictures with these words. He said, what's most important is that you stay alert. We don't know the exact time. We know that it may not be immediate, but we need to think of it as imminent, meaning it could take place at any time. What's the message in that? Always be ready. Always be ready for the Messiah's return. And the analogy of the fig tree tells me that it's sooner than we knew. In 1948, Israel became a nation. The fig tree began to blossom, and things have been on the move ever since then. In verse 43, in kind of closing, he says that had the owner of the house known when the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not allowed his house to be broken into. Obviously, a thief does not announce his arrival in advance, but he comes when least expected. So in a way, the Messiah's return is equated to like a thief robbing a house. Not in morality, but it's just practicality. So he said, you too must always be ready, for the Son of Man will come upon you when you're least expecting. Verse 44. Even when you're slumbering, we need to be alert. Messiah is at the door. We're hearing the footsteps of the Messiah. And then to close this section, he speaks of being a servant in this kingdom with a few illustrations. He says to the people who were listening to him and to us even now that we need to be talking to his disciples about these themes that come out of Matthew 24. They speak of Jewish themes, how that we need to help other people understand what's happening, especially because he's speaking here to the Jewish people, not to the Gentile church. His great burden, Yeshua's great burden, although he loved Gentiles, his great burden was for his own people, the Jewish people. He said, I've come only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He even never left the land of Israel, except that one little trip to Egypt with his parents, because he felt called to help his people get to know the God of Israel. So he asks in verse 45, who is the faithful servant? The faithful and sensible servant? Well, the one who follows the ways of the Lord. And it says that one will be rewarded by being put in charge of the entire staff. It will go well with that servant if he's found doing his job when the master comes. Verse 46. Well, we want to be that kind of servant, don't we? We don't want to be the servant who is wicked in verse 48. The wicked servant says, my master is taking his time, so I'll do whatever I want. Well, verse 49 tells us when the master returns, if that servant is not doing what he was left to do, the master will beat up his fellow servants and spend time eating and drinking with drunkards. That's what the wicked servant will do. So when does the master come? He doesn't come at an expected time. He comes at an unexpected time, and he sees these people who are not, that he left in charge of doing certain things. He will be so grievously angry at them, it says he will cut them in two and put them with the hypocrites. It's a great judgment on such people who would not follow what Yeshua has given them to do. Now, let's remember, our friends, especially my congregation, Emmanuel, God has given us some service to perform. God has called our congregation to reach Jewish people with the message of the Messiah and teach Gentile people about the ways of the Jewish people through the Torah. And we're glad to do that. That's our calling. Also, we have to learn to live better and live more godly, which comes when we study the Torah, which we do. He wants people to recognize this. Otherwise, they might be set outside the safe zone, and they'll be in Gehinnom, and people will wail and grind their teeth. That is the judgment of those people who do not follow the ways of Yeshua at this very, very devastating time of history. Either we choose to be faithful servants of the Messiah, and I think we know what that means. If we don't, keep hanging in with us, and you'll learn more and more and more, or will not be judged to be servants of the Messiah and will be considered wicked. We're either good servants or wicked servants. We come to a decision point in our lives, and I lay it before you that it's time for us to make a decision if we haven't. Are you following Yeshua? Maybe you've trusted Yeshua for salvation, but are you following him? Are you following his ways that are revealed to us in the Torah and then expounded upon us throughout the prophets and even into Brit Hadashah? We need to make a commitment to follow the ways of Yeshua so we'll be blessed when he comes, not cursed. So next week, I'll share with you some more parabolic teaching that we get from Matthew, parables about the return of King Messiah. We'll have a better picture of what this is going to be all about. And now I'll close my message, turn this back over to Carrie to wrap up our service.
Thank you, Rabbi. We will begin to close the service with the Great Kaddish. May his great...